Hello, everybody. Today, I am delighted to welcome award-winning author Dan Fesperman to Spybrary. He's written, this is his 13th novel, and today we're going to find out more about it. It was a big hit with our friend Joseph Cannon. It was a big hit with me. If you love books, spy stories that include the GDR, Marcus Wolf, the Stasi, the KGB, East Berlin, West Berlin, the CIA, Cold War, this is it. Dan, welcome to Spybrary.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. And I love all those kinds of stories too, which is why I wrote this book.
Absolutely. And I have, regular listeners know, I have a special section of my Spybrary, which is just for books that are written in or about Berlin. And I might need to buy another house now because just to house that collection of books. And that leads me to my first question, because this year we've been spoiled. You know, we had Joe Cannon's book, Burn Exchange. We had Paul Viddick's Matchmaker. And now yours. So what is it about Berlin for you spy authors that you just can't get away from?
It's such a haunting place. You go there. I mean, before I moved there in '93, and I moved there a few years after reunification. So East Berlin still looked pretty much like it had during the Cold War. And it just gets under your skin. It is, I've mentioned, I think in a couple of books now, that it is it's like a theme park of 20th century horrors. And it's steeped in that atmosphere. And then when you throw into that, for me anyway, having read all these books like The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, which begins and ends at the Berlin Wall, all of that, all of these wonderful noir black and white movies that were filmed there back in the 60s when spy films first became a thing. You just can't get it out of your system. And the best way to try to do that is to write a book about it and live there for a while, research it, and just let yourself get steeped in it.
Absolutely. In fact, we had a fun episode of Spybrary back Christmas time. And one of the questions I was asked was, you know, are we done with Berlin spy books now? And I kind of said, well, I don't know where more stories are coming from. There's been so many. And then you three come along this year and knock out 3 smashing books on Berlin, and always something to riff about. Let me quickly read the synopsis here, and then we'll dig into the book.
Sure.
So for those who aren't familiar, Winter Work, now available. On a chilly early morning walk on the wooded outskirts of Berlin, Emil Grimm finds the body of his neighbor, a fellow Stasi officer named Lothar, with a gunshot wound to the temple and a pistol in his right hand. Despite appearances, Emil suspects murder. If it were a few months earlier, he would have known just what to do. But now, as East Germany disintegrates, being a Stasi colonel is more of a liability than an asset. More troubling still is that Emil and Lothar were actively involved in a final clandestine mission. Now Emil must finish the job alone. So very intriguing plot here. So I think what I particularly appreciated about your work is much of it was based on historical fact. And I just kind of teased you about writing, you know, another book on Berlin. But there are, even though I'm well read on GDR history and the Stasi, I wasn't aware of the Rosenholtz Operation.
Yes.
And I wonder if we could start there for our listeners who are also not aware of the Rosenholtz Operation. What was it and how did it influence Winter Work?
Yeah, I wasn't aware of it either until I was poking around a little before I even had an idea for this book. And I came across an old news story about how the U.S. government had finally turned over to the German government. This wasn't, I forget when this was, but it was looking back at that decision to turn over all of these Stasi agent files that they had secretly obtained after the fall of the wall as Germany was reuniting. When all the spoils of Stasi secrets were suddenly up for grabs. And they said it had a name, Rosenholtz. And when I thought, well, that sounds like a nice subject for a novel. And when I went looking for information on it, it was very scanty, and it still is. And some of the best information on it were in dry scholarly journals. American newspapers have had very little about it, and when they have, it's the details just aren't there. No one really even knows for sure how they were obtained. There were different theories, competing theories, but all of this, to me, in a way, was great because I thought, wonderful, I can fill in the blanks however I want. and it will all be within the realm of plausibility, because I'm going to use some of these theories that are out there. I'm going to work with those, and I'm going to take what I know and what I'm able to find out in research and kind of write my own scenario for how I think it might have come about and what that would have meant for people like Emil Grimm and Lothar Fischer and some of the CIA people involved.
So the book starts February 1990. It's the last few months of the GDR. What was life like from your own research? What can you share with us? What was it like for government officials, and particularly the Stasi, where they saw this whole state crumbling? What was life like for them?
The higher up you were in the chain of command, the more vulnerable you felt. You mentioned Marcus Wolf. He was retired by then, but he'd only been retired 4 years, and he had headed the Stasi's foreign intelligence branch for a long time. He'd started it, basically. He'd been among the people who started it. And he was worried about being prosecuted, with good reason, because the West German government did eventually charge him. So there was fear of prosecution. There was fear of ostracism, which was going on. They were kind of laying low. They were looking for lawyers. They were wondering if they could, some of them were looking to make a deal, saying, I've got all these secrets. If you can give me safe harbor and a condo in California, I'll tell you what I know. Marcus Wolf's own son-in-law was approached by the West German government, and I forget the figure, it's in the book. He was offered millions of Deutschmarks, and not only did he turn it down, he then attempted suicide. He survived, but it was this existential crisis. Their whole life's meaning was suddenly been fallen away almost overnight. And now they were facing a very bleak future. So that was your situation. And then you had the CIA, MI6, the KGB as well, for their own reasons, wondering what was going to become of all these secrets and all of these people who were in place and maybe still unknown as agents at NATO headquarters in West Germany, maybe in the United States. What was going to become of all those agents that were suddenly out there without a master to work for anymore?
Yeah, absolutely. Complete chaos, carnage in the GDR. And you do a really good job, I think, of recreating 1990 Berlin, and also the personalities involved. You know, what was it like for the Volkspolizei, who suddenly were higher ranking than the Stasi because they were the police of the land? And you have this wonderful relationship in the book with a Volkspolizei officer who's suddenly ruling the roost when it comes to the law.
I have a great deal of fun with this character, Marius Dorn. He's a lieutenant. He's in his mid to late 20s. He's young, and he's not old enough to have been tainted politically by the system. And because he wasn't in the Stasi, he was in the sort of the civilian police. He is pretty confident he's going to ride it out because they still need policemen, and he knows he's going to keep his job. And it's his boss who's worried about, he's thoroughly a part of the system, and that's fine with him too because he didn't like his boss. So he starts working with Emil, but Emil is pretty adept at manipulating some of his hopes and dreams as well, and some of his fears and being enmeshed in the old parts of the system. So, you had characters like that who saw new opportunities, but who didn't want to get too entangled with some of these older guys like Emil as well.
Absolutely. So let's talk about Emil, because he is the central character here. And there's a wonderful quote. I'll just quickly read this out, where you wrote, Emil hadn't foreseen the system's collapse. Who could have? But the widening gap between the party's slogans and the reality on the street had been evident for anyone who wasn't either blind or a fool. So immediately you know that this is a guy who's a realist. He's not, blinded by the philosophy and by the regime and the propaganda. And we find him in the forest discovering a dead body. Where do we go from there? Where does the plot go from there?
From there, what complicates things for him when he discovers the body? He discovers the body because another member of the Stasi hierarchy, is Dieter Kraus, who is an officer but does not outrank Emil. But he's from a part of the Stasi which was known as the Spezialkommission, and that existed. It was part of the Stasi, very little known, which was used to kind of clean up messes, handle politically sensitive cases. And he's on the scene of this crime, where the body is, and Emil is wondering, well, how is this guy even still working? We're all out of business. Who's he reporting to? Why is he here? Why does he think he even has any authority in this matter? And then, of course, the police lieutenant, Maria Storn, shows up and shoos them all away and says, all of you guys are out of business. This is my case. So from there, Emil starts playing with and against the dynamic that's changing so fast. Like, okay, do I really have to worry about Dieter Krauss anymore like I used to? Maybe, maybe not. But if I do have to worry about him, is it because he's working with the Russians? Is it because he's working with the Americans? What's going on here? All the alliances were shifting, and people were making their own deals in secret. And one person never knew who the other person they were dealing with might have been making a secret deal with. So it was very fraught with danger. It was fraught with some comedy, too, because they were kind of tripping over each other. And so was the CIA, actually. Their early role in this operation in trying to get these records from people like Emil and from the Russians who might have access, it was pretty clumsy as well there in the beginning.
Yeah, you write in the book with Baucom talking about how they were, and Claire, how they were cold calling, door knocking Stasi agents for information. I mean, and that's based on fact. That's not something you've dreamt up.
There's a great account of all that. And there was a CIA nonfiction book about mostly focusing on the end game in the Soviet Union and how all these people were getting rounded up due to betrayals within the CIA. But it talked a lot about how in Berlin there was all this cold calling going on. They were visiting them door to door. They were acting like salesmen, and not very good salesmen. They were getting hang-ups and angry lectures and people slamming the door in their faces. And it did not go well, at first anyway.
Yeah, that book is called The Main Enemy, and I wasn't familiar with it. And you, at the end of your book, my family are not going to be happy with you because I've gone spending, because we'll dig into this a little bit later, but you cite quite a few books that you used for your research. And that was one that I hadn't come across before. So, that sounds up my Strasse, as they say. So I've ordered that one. So I'm intrigued to read that, because I wasn't aware that that's how they were trying to recruit agents.
Yeah, and that book was by Milt Bearden, a former CIA guy, and James Risen, who was a reporter with the New York Times and very good on national intelligence matters.
It's interesting you mentioned reporters, just going on a slight tangent, because we recently published, one of our contributors is Tim Shipman, who is the chief political commentator at the Sunday Times. And I don't know how he found the time to do this. He wrote up his top 125 spy authors, not just what he thought were the best, but he also put them in, the ranking order and which was his best ones. And by the way, you were in his top 40.
Top 40 is big in America, so that's
yeah. And I told him that he's got to read this book. So I think when he revisits this, we just had a live panel on the weekend where we dug into some of his choices. And I'm pretty confident you'll be going up that list. I mean, there's good people at that level. You've got Freddie Forsyth and the chap Jason Matthews. He's in that level as well. So it's a nice berth to be in. But anyway, the reason I bring that up is I said to Tim, there's an awful lot of journalists that wrote spy books.
Yeah.
When you look through, Freddie Forsyth was a journalist. He worked for Reuters in East Berlin, but there's so many of them. And then I saw that, your background of being a foreign correspondent in Berlin. I'm like, you journalist, you can spin a good spy yarn.
Yeah, it's funny. There's a lot of journalists and there are a lot of spies, of course, who wrote too. One of my previous novels, The Double Game, was sort of all about spies who write spy novels and how much truth they put in them and how much truth they hide, and how their own life stories tend to creep into those novels. And it's funny because journalists and spies have this strange relationship. They're both very curious about each other. They're both, in a lot of ways, in the same business. They want to know what's really going on. And journalists want to know what's really going on so they can just open it up to everybody. And spies want to know what's really going on so they can use it to acquire more knowledge and keep it all a secret among themselves. So that's where their paths diverge. But I think they have a lot of sympathy and a lot of understanding of each other because they're both driven by similar motivations.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. So go back to the book then. What's going on in Emil Grimm's home life in terms of his wife? There's a special situation going on there. Yeah,
his wife has ALS, or as we call it in the United States, Lou Gehrig's disease. It's sort of a wasting disease where you gradually lose your capacity to move at all. You can't speak after a while. She has reached the locked in phase where she can no longer talk, but she can blink. She communicates yes and no, and by blinking, she and Emil are still very close, and they have a caretaker who is very close to both of them as well, Carola Weber, who was one of Bettina, his wife's best friends. And there's this odd triangle relationship that's strange, but it's actually kind of sweet between the three of them as well, as they're living in this dacha in the woods just north of Berlin.
Yeah, no, I like that. I think it gave him an extra dimension. He wasn't just this, ex-Stasi kind of stereotype.
Yeah.
Having his home life, because that's very important, I think, to the plot. That
it is.
2 paychecks away from, or his 2 last paychecks, and he's got to care for his wife, and they don't know if the state are going to pay for her medical expenses. I mean, there was so much confusion at that time. So that propels Emil to do what he does in this book. And I don't really want to go into Spoilerville too much, and don't know how much you want to reveal in this, but, I guess the question for you is, when you were writing Emil, did you want us to feel sorrow for him and compassion? Did you want the reader to root for him?
I think by the end, I want the reader to root for him. In the beginning, I wanted you to just understand him and see him as a complicated person, as possibly someone with good motives caught up in a very bad system and maybe still coming to terms with how bad of a system he was a part of. And I knew at some point I wanted there to be a reckoning for him about his own past within that system and his own abuses of the power of that system. My big dilemma in going in was, how long was I going to wait before I made the reader aware of that reckoning, and how was I going to bring it about? And as it turned out, I don't want any spoilers either, but it turned out a moment presented itself where he was in the perfect place at the perfect time in the perfect situation for that to occur. And so it felt kind of serendipitous that it turned out that way. Yeah,
that's the situation with his neighbor, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. In his apartment in Berlin. I love that, by the way, because I was rooting for him. Thought, okay, I get it. He's got to care for his wife, and he's figuring his way. And then that's passage with something that happens again. I don't want to go into it, but I thought that was superbly played, because then I'm questioning myself: do I actually like this guy? For him to have done that, I'm rooting for him, and now I'm questioning it.
Yeah. That's
very well done.
Should be, and because he's questioning himself when he thinks back to that, and that was sort of the moment when he realized this system that I work for is a failure because it has allowed me to do this.
Yeah.
And in fact, it has encouraged him to do that in a way. So that's sort of where he began to part ways with, at least in his mind, with certain aspects of the system. So while he was as caught off guard as anybody by the wall coming down and the whole system falling, and was as unprepared as anyone, he also, in a certain way, was ready for it.
Yeah, I also like that scene when he went across to West Berlin to get his welcome money, and he has to show his passport, and of course it's got all these foreign countries on it, and the bank teller's obviously twigged that he works for the government or he's part of that regime. That was a lovely little scene as well, Dan. I enjoyed that. Also, so the characters in this book, so let's move on. So as we mentioned earlier on, Markus Wolf features in this. How much fun was it for you to recreate conversations that Wolf has with Emil? They live next door to each other in Prenden, this very in the middle of a forest north of Berlin. How much fun was that for you?
It was a lot of fun. And in my research, when I went up to around the Prenden area, around the Bauersee, this small lake up in the woods, I walked on the trails right behind where Markus Wolf's dacha is, or actually was, because he's now deceased. And there were some, in his memoir, he wrote of receiving a secretive CIA visitor there with his wife beside him on the couch. And he recorded the conversation that occurred for his own protection. And this was when he was trying to negotiate his own future. And because of his tone in his memoirs, which was, as many memoirs are, very self-serving, a pride in his work came through, and he was very good at it. But also an arrogance and also a defensiveness about what the Stasi stood for. And I used some of that to sort of inject that into his character in these scenes. And I had a great deal of fun writing these scenes because he does have a great deal of pride, and in some ways he is a bit too prideful. And Emil is a very good reader of human nature and of human weakness, and he's able to kind of use some of those weaknesses of pride to get information out of Wolf in ways that he might not have been otherwise.
Having read a fair bit on Wolf myself, I thought you got it spot on. I think there was nothing jarring on the page. I thought, well, he wouldn't have said that. I think you was very charming, extremely clever.
Very urbane, and yes, a very sharp guy and a sharp dresser, yes.
Absolutely. We often say on the show, we have a feature about who would come to your ideal or fantasy spy dinner, and Wolf is right up there.
Yes.
For me. But, I just think he just he wouldn't give you real answers anyway. Even if he did come to dinner, he's not going to spill the beans on what was happening. What did you think? So his book, his memoir, which is one of my favorite nonfiction spy books, it's remarkable how they punched above their weight, the HVA. He seemed to kind of distance himself from Milker and Honecker and that crowd. As a journalist, what did you think? Did you think he's being honest, or is he just recreating the past?
I think it's a little of both. I think he was being honest about his accomplishments, but I think he was also, let's face it, no matter how terrible he thought Erich Mielke was, he worked for the man and he did his bidding, and he knew what the system was doing in his own country. He knew what it stood for. And I think the most interesting moment, and this is referred to in the book as well, I think he underestimated as well how resentful the population was of people like him, even though he was in foreign intelligence and supposedly was fighting the good fight abroad. Because when he went to speak at a protest about 5 days before the wall came down, it was at Alexanderplatz. There were hundreds of thousands of people there. He stood up on the back of a pickup truck where all the speakers were standing. He had his notes in his hand. And as he started to speak about how the regime and its people still needed to come together, he was booed. They were whistling at him. And I think he was really taken aback. He just had no idea. He saw himself as the one who would bridge this gap between the people and their government. And they didn't boo him off the stage, but they were very disrespectful of him in a way that he never would have anticipated. Yeah. I think that woke him up. And I think he saw, like, this is who I am. This is who I've become. But by the time he wrote his memoir, he didn't really, he didn't want to focus on that aspect too much, I don't think.
No. So there was his memoir, and there's also his cookbook. He wrote a cookbook, which I don't have here, but I want to try and buy it, because it's remarkable that the spy master Wolf, who allegedly was Le Carre's influence for Carla, although Le Carre, he's another one, it's hard to get the truth out of him. He denied it, didn't he? He said, no, it's not about that wretched man. Yeah. Absolutely. So very interesting passages with Markus Wolf. And it's not just he's a bystander. He plays an important part in this. This is what I would say to our listeners. Let's talk about Bauckham. What can you share with us about Bauckham? Am I pronouncing it right?
Yeah, okay. Clark Bauckham. And he appeared in a previous novel. He appeared in Safe Houses, where he was having an affair with a much younger woman working for the CIA. There's Safe House. And in this book, by the time this book is occurring, which was about 5-6 years after the scenes in Safe Houses, he has retired, or rather the CIA has retired him. You get the impression it wasn't completely his idea. And but Claire goes to him because she knows him from the previous work together in Safe Houses. And she uses him as a font of institutional knowledge because he's been in or around Berlin and in Eastern Europe since not long after the Second World War. So he really knows the scene. He knows where all the bodies are buried or where they're still alive. And Claire, who's based in Paris, has been brought in to help with this big push to try to dig up these secrets and make these new contacts. So she relies on him sort of as an unauthorized source of information. And it was helpful for me, too, to have him there because he has seen it all. He's seen how the U.S. and the CIA made compromises right after the Second World War with another set of German scoundrels, with the Nazis, for either because they knew rocket science or they knew nuclear physics or because they knew Soviet intelligence, people like Reinhard Gehlen, for instance, who they hired on even though he had been a Nazi. So he's kind of seeing history repeat itself, and he's fascinated by it, and he's a little bit repulsed by it. So he really wants to meet people like Wolf, who were his enemy for years. But he also has this certain sense of, well, here we are doing the same thing again, making accommodations for people because they can help us out.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I enjoyed that character, the old head, right, that was there and guiding her. And then there was an interesting relationship between Claire and her boss, Lindsay Ward. What can you share with us about that? Yeah,
Lindsay Ward has also come in from Langley. She's high up in the chain of command in Langley, and she's come there because she basically doesn't think that the station chief in East Berlin, which was a forlorn little station, and the base chief in West Berlin, it was called a base because the station chief was in Bonn, weren't really getting it done in terms of making contacts with these Stasi people. They need a kick in the rear, so she comes over there to kind of lead the operation that people like Claire are involved in. And because she is someone who's so near the top, she's got her own ambitions as well. She's pretty good at having those ambitions coincide with what the agency needs, but Claire's a bit wary of her because she wonders if she might be a little too bent on success to worry about the safety of some of the people like her who are working beneath her and trying to get these secrets.
Absolutely. And Claire develops a soft spot, I think it's fair to say, for Emil Grimm.
Yeah, a soft spot for Grimm, and she has a soft spot for Clark Bauckham, her old retired colleague. And an interesting dynamic develops between her and Emil, because they should be enemies. They were adversaries for years. And suddenly, in a weird way, they're working toward the same thing, not just seeing what will happen to these secrets everybody wants, but seeing what's going to happen to these people who are suddenly vulnerable and whether they're going to be trampled underfoot or worse by the higher ups, people like her boss and like his old boss.
Absolutely. I want to talk a little bit about, there is violence in this book. You're pretty good at writing grisly deaths.
There isn't a whole lot of that, but there are some of that. Yeah.
No, and there is. So is it Andreas Plotz from memory? In the bath. And I think what that helped me with is I read it and thought, oh, crikey, if Emil gets picked up. So the story here is that the KGB are also after these files and for nefarious reasons. And they kind of kill whoever in their way. And there's that one scene where 3 of them come after Claire when she's going on a treff to meet a contact. And then the scene, I just thought you wrote that, beautiful is the wrong word. It was grisly, but enough to make me scared for the main character. Think, he really does not want, these guys, they're not, I forget the expression I'm trying to come up with here. They're not playing, they're going to cause some severe damage.
Yeah. And what was so frightening for Emil about all of that as well was for years he had operated in a zone of safety because in his world and in the real world that existed in the Cold War, there was this gentleman's agreement, never written down, between the Russians, the British, the Americans, that we will not harm each other's people. The people in the middle, the cutouts, the locals, whether they're Czech or Hungarian or, say, East German or West German, but the people who get in our way and who are working for us down on the ground, okay, they're vulnerable, they're fair game, but not our people. And now suddenly Emil, who has had the benefit of that rule's no good for him anymore because the Stasi's off the board. So he's down there with the rabble that he used to take for granted as well. And now he knows what it feels like.
And that contributed to a very suspenseful ending for me. Again, I'm not going into Spoilerville, but I wasn't sure what way it was going to go at the end because of how violent the KGB were and how tricky customers that they were. I thought, I don't know what's going to happen here. And I was pretty nervous turning over those pages towards the end. I have to tell you, Dan, it's
good. Glad to hear that.
Job done. There was another scene with Bauckham that was based on reality. What can you tell us about former military attaché Otto Cheney?
Oh, yes. Otto Cheney was a military attaché in the Czech Republic, or as it was known then, Czechoslovakia. And I heard this story, and his name is in the acknowledgments. I heard a story from one of his former colleagues who told me at a book reading I did in Dallas, Texas. He came up afterwards. He says, I was in the intelligence community, and then later we corresponded by email. And he told me about this guy. He said it was a great story that he was on. What happened was there was a Warsaw Pact military exercise, war games going on in the Czech countryside in Bohemia. There were tanks on the move and Soviet units of the Soviet army on the move. And so this military attaché would go out in this vehicle painted very much to look like a military vehicle that might be out in the area. He and the Italian attaché went out there to kind of scope it out and see what they could see for intelligence purposes. And they were hoping they weren't going to get pulled over. And so then they were off on the side of the road, and a Russian colonel pulled up beside them. And they thought, oh, well, you know, the game is up. We're going to get caught. I hope we don't get detained and nothing bad happens to us. And the Soviet general basically was furious because he was lost. And he couldn't make heads or tails of the maps he had. And he said, can you help us find our way? And didn't realize this was an American. And so the American got out and said, well, let me see your maps. And he spread them out on the hood of the car. And it was a map of the entire exercise with all the units marked, their dispositions, what they were doing in the exercise. And this guy thought, I have to keep this map open as long as I can and memorize as much as I can. And it was a wonderful story, which he then later told to a U.S. Congressional Committee about how he memorized as much as he could, was never identified by the Russian, because he could speak Russian as well, and Czech, and then got back in his car and drove away and had all this stuff, and he had to write it down as quick as he could. So I took that story and adapted it for my own purpose for an old story that Clark Bauckham tells about himself when he was out there in the same area roving around with the U.S. military attaché.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that section of the book. And then when I read the acknowledgments of where that came from, it's like, oh, wow, that's really good. Yeah. I just love how you wove that into the story.
Yeah, it was a wonderful piece of lore. So.
Yeah. You mentioned there about being at a book signing, launch presentation, etc. at Dallas. I mean, what's it been like for you as an author? Because obviously with COVID and nobody traveling anywhere, is that something you've missed, getting out on the road and talking about your work?
Yeah, I do. And precisely because of things like that, you get to interact with readers face to face. They'll tell you things like that. At that one reading in particular in Dallas, there were about 4 or 5 people. I don't know why they were all in Dallas. They came up to me afterwards, and they were all part of the community, as they put it. And they had all worked, I think some were with military intelligence, some were with CIA. And I do get a fair amount of correspondence from people in that world who will read these things and then tell me little stories. And it's great because I can then use those stories. I change them, of course, and don't put their names in there. But it gives me great material to use in subsequent books.
But also, you must be proud of the fact that your writing's very credible. If you have people from the community who are coming out to your book readings and your signings and reading your books, then they must think you're getting quite close to what actually happened.
I suppose so. I hope so. And I had an advantage in that area, too, because for 12, 13 years now, off and on, I've been working on a TV project that has to do with the history of the early history of the CIA when they were transitioning from the OSS. And 12 years ago, I probably interviewed about 24 former OSS and early CIA people about their careers in that era, in the 40s, the 50s. Great material. And the show still is in development, as they say. But anyway, I got tons of great material about different personalities, and I've used it in all my books. And the weird thing was I was just looking at all the names of people I interviewed. I was looking at them about 2-3 months ago, and probably about 20 of those 24 are now deceased. So I feel like I was very lucky in that I got to talk to all these people before they passed away and mine them for all these wonderful stories of theirs.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. Well, I thoroughly enjoyed winter work. The one question I wanted to ask you is, all your books there, they've got beautiful covers.
Oh, thank you.
Especially Safe Houses. That was a beautiful cover. But I noticed that the one in the UK is different from the American version. How is that decision made? Do you know?
It's the publishers. Just my publisher in the UK, wanted to have their own cover. And that's been true with pretty much all of my books. Yeah. And I think there's a difference. You can see the style, too, because you look at the UK cover and you say, oh, that's a UK cover. You can look at American and UK covers and often tell which is which, no matter who the author is.
It always fascinates me.
Yeah.
Some people collect paintings and art. I collect books for the covers. I've been known to buy a book just for the cover, and I like them both. And I saw the UK one. I thought, oh yeah, I like that very typical East German architecture of that building in the background. That's the DDR.
Exactly.
Yeah. So if someone listening to the show today, hopefully they go out, buy the book, love it, enjoy it. Of your other dozen books, where should they go then? Which of your other works do you think they should read, having read Winter Work?
Well, I would read Safe Houses because it has some of the characters you'll be familiar with. The cover wife, it's funny, if you look at the only character who is in all three of these is Claire Saylor, the CIA operative. But if you look at these books in terms of parts in her saga, Safe Houses would be parts 1 and 4. Winter Work would be part 2. And The Cover Wife would be part 3. So I guess if you really want to do it right for her saga, you'd read Safe Houses first, Winter Work second, and The Cover Wife third. But beyond that, I don't know, take your pick. If you like spy novels and are fascinated by spies who write spy novels, I would definitely also read The Double Game, which was a lot of...
That was how I found your work. One of our community members, Jeff, who was at the Spybrary blog, he was a big supporter of that book. He said, you've got to go read that one. Because when I started Spybrary 5 years ago, I thought I was pretty well read, but I've been completely schooled. And that's why we set the podcast on community up, because there's so many great writers out there, so many great books. And, we serve to try and help our listeners discover those books. So, The Double Game is well loved among our Spybrary community, Dan.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Now, I know you've done a lot of interviews talking about Winter Work. Are there any questions that you wish a podcaster or journalist or reporter asked you about Winter Work that they haven't asked you yet?
Not so much a question as one thing I thought that I would be asked a lot is, and a friend of mine, a writer friend of mine, mentioned it, and he was the first and he's the only one who has, is that why the name Emil Grimm? And it's because this whole setting, especially where he lives in the dark forest. There are creatures out there who may get you at night. I just love there's a certain fairy tale aspect to this, a very dark Brothers Grimm fairy tale aspect to this, in that this is a place that's full of hazards and unknowns. And I'm surprised that I haven't yet been asked, or asked a lot even, about, Emil Grimm, is that because of? And yes, it is because of.
Ah, okay. I didn't even think about it. Actually, just took the name at face value and went with it. But I did like how you described those German forests.
Yeah. The Germans, having lived there for 3 years, there's the Germans and the woods, they just have this wonderful relationship with trees in general.
Yeah.
In fact, I did a story that was kind of funny once when I was there for the Baltimore Sun about this whole tree bureaucracy that is there. Every major tree in Berlin has a number on it, if you look closely enough. Every tree along the street and on park sidewalks is numbered. And you think, wait a minute, this is German record keeping at its worst. And I talked to the people who kept track of those records, and there's a real purpose for it. But it's so typical. It's their love of order and record keeping and their love of the forest, and it's combined. So, Germans in the forest, it goes back to all their legends and their operas, and everything comes from out of the forest, and it's all sort of primeval. So I had a lot of fun with that in this book as well.
Absolutely. I think I'll stay in the Kneipe. I'll have my Dunkel beer, and I'll let others go into the German forest. They sound a bit scary for me. What's next for you, Dan? Are you working on another book? What's the next project for you?
I am, and this one's going to be, it's a little different for me. It is a spy novel as well, and it's going to be set in a fictional Eastern European country, partly because I don't want to libel any leaders of current Eastern European countries. And it's going to involve a U.S. operation involving a fairly scandalized American entertainer who is become a favorite of one of the leaders over there. So anyway.
Very intriguing. We'll be looking out for that one.
Yes.
Marvelous. Your book is available in all good bookshops. It's on Amazon, com and UK. I urge, listen, if you've been listening to Spybrary for so long, you know the kind of books I enjoy. And Winter Work is right up there. This is the book that like I was saying earlier on before we came on air, I reread Joe Cannon's Berlin Exchange when I was quarantined with COVID in Berlin. And Winter Work will take pride of place in my Berlin Spybrary here at Station V, Dan.
Thank you so much. And thanks for all the kind words, too. It's really nice of you. So thanks.